The universe of No, I'm Not a Human is a complete mystery. When you feel you're starting to put it together, another major plot hole appears. If the sun is exploding and the glaciers are melting, why did this lady on the phone say she fled to an Arctic area? If visitors are corpses resurrected by a parasite, then what the hell is that? Why can some visitors wipe out an entire squad of armed soldiers and others can't remember if they ate yesterday? If FEMA is run by visitors, why are they being attacked by their own kind? If visitors don't actually exist and this is all FEMA's fabrication, how do you explain the multiple eyewitnesses that saw dead bodies get back up again? Or without going any further, how do you explain the pale man lurking around the house? Did visitors dig themselves out of their graves? Did they come from another dimension? Or are they a man-made failed experiment? In this video, I'll compile the most plausible theories regarding the world of No, I'm Not a Human, with the objective of extracting one final conclusion out of all of them, an attempt to solve the mystery once and for all. Among the many crappy, low plausibility conspiracies that the researcher throws at us, like FEMA standing for Facility to Eradicate Mankind Altogether, there is one that is most likely truthful. I cover this in greater detail in my previous video, but the researcher claims that visitors are infected with a brain parasite that crawls in through the ears. It is uncertain if the parasite is the insect itself, or if it's carried by insects, sort of how cordyceps act in nature, but one thing's for sure. This theory is extremely plausible, since many characters that have been in contact with visitors or have been in the quarantine zones show positive results in the ear test. The parasite theory also explains why FEMA wear hazmat suits. It is contagious and can infect both living and dead organisms, bringing them back to life. Perhaps we're dealing with an ancient parasite that was sealed away in glaciers, and when the sun's activity started rising, it was released into the water and eventually ingested by the first carriers. This theory can be quickly dismantled with this interaction on phone roulette. The woman on the other end of the line explains how she fled to a place where the cold cuts to the bone. It is through this phone call that we find out this is a local phenomenon, clearly not affecting other parts of the world. It is for this same reason that FEMA put the whole city on lockdown and respond with lethal force to anybody who attempts to flee. If the parasite manages to escape the city, it's game over. More on FEMA later. For now, a couple more theories on the origin of the parasite. Could the parasite be carried by animals, specifically stray dogs? There are multiple references to these animals all throughout the game. We see stray dogs out the window since day one. The pale visitor mentions that dogs rule the world, and later during the week, the news announces that packs of wild dogs are terrorizing the city. Though it is interesting, I don't believe this theory to be true. Surely, if this was the case, FEMA would advise checking people for bite marks. Also, the cat seems to be unaffected by the parasite, despite being in very close proximity to a host. In the fatal child ending, the baby can be seen drinking dog's milk. It is later mentioned that the baby must be destroyed, for it is the incarnation of all evil. This baby is directly tied to the next theory, which I personally support. There are many references to fungi all throughout the game. The protagonist develops a fungal infection. His favorite drink is kombucha, a fermented beverage that serves as the ideal medium for fungal growth. And even the scammer on the phone advises not to drink it, since it contributes to the health of the fungus inside of him. If that wasn't enough, there's a whole ending tied to mycelium, in which a giant mushroom takes over the city. I believe this represents the fact that the parasite could not be contained and spread worldwide. But what about the baby? Well, it's a product of two people infected by the fungus, a pure breed of visitor, the perfect host, hence why it must be destroyed. The protagonist, in a state of confusion, fires a blind shot at the mist, unintentionally eliminating the child. He becomes the new savior and is crucified for humanity's sins. I personally believe that the fungus theory is the most plausible of them all, and can even go hand in hand with the researcher's conclusion. But even if we knew exactly what the parasite was, where did it come from? This theory states that the parasite was man-made, and that visitors are a biological weapon designed by FEMA. Either at one point something went wrong and they were released unwillingly, or FEMA intentionally deployed them. Or perhaps FEMA had the parasite safely contained, until the temperature suddenly rose, and an accident happened in the lab, triggering the disaster. This is clearly a local and not a worldwide problem, so whatever it is that they accidentally released cannot under any circumstance spread anywhere else. This explains why FEMA becomes so hostile towards people during the second week, shooting anybody that tries to leave the city. FEMA has no problem with mass killings, so long as the parasite can be contained. We discover through dialogues with people who have escaped their quarantine zones that these zones are actually a graveyard for anybody that shows symptoms. The outbreak must be contained at all costs. Though, if this is a local and not a global problem, how can we justify the sun's activity increasing only in our area? Surely it would have to affect the rest of the world, if the problem is the sun. This immediately discards the possibility of the parasite being released as a consequence of a drastic rise in temperatures. Here's my theory. Instead of the classic interpretation of the game, which is, the sun is exploding and visitors have crawled out of the ground, my scenario is, the visitor parasite has escaped and FEMA has artificially raised the temperature to kill it. I'd like to give some attention to the following comment by this user that mentions that something in the air could be flammable or refracting sunlight. The rise in temperature, though sold to the public as a natural occurrence, could actually be FEMA's plan of action to eliminate the parasite they accidentally released, similar to how the human body raises its internal temperature to eliminate a threat. This would explain why the unbearable heat only seems to affect our area. To be honest, I completely support this theory. The Immortal Man tells us more about this, and how this is all a huge mistake by FEMA, who are desperately trying to fix their error. I based most of my research for my last video on this character's dialogue, and I'll happily do it again, since he seems to be key to the story. A fun fact about the Immortal Man, whose actual name is Jakob, is that he stars in Tryoska's upcoming game Lost in the Roots, apparently set in the same universe as No, I'm Not a Human. When we first meet him, we're even awarded an achievement that confirms this. Clearly, we're dealing with an essential character here, and I believe there is more to him that we'll hopefully find out with the release of Lost in the Roots. However, this theory directly collides with the researchers' claim that FEMA is run by visitors. If it were, why would they bother creating an inhospitable environment for themselves? My personal belief is that FEMA is mainly run by humans, but has infiltrated visitors. Have you ever noticed how every time they come to your door, they usually take humans? It's almost as if their intention is to leave you alone with the visitors, so you can be one of them. But let's believe FEMA for a second and suppose that the sun's increased activity is real and has nothing to do with them. As the man in the stained shirt says, the sun is not killing us, but acting in response to the visitors being unleashed on Earth. Perhaps its high temperatures force them to retreat underground during the day, granting mankind at least a little bit of safety. But are we implying that the sun is a sentient being that can regulate its temperature as it wishes? Surely not. If this scenario were to be true, it must be because of some divine intervention. The closest thing to a divine figure we have in the game is death itself, worshipped by many humans ever since the apocalypse started. The cultists don't fear death, they embrace it. Death is their salvation, and perhaps ours too. In the middle of the apocalypse, this entity attacks the FEMA quarantine zones, resulting in many casualties. Was death killing visitors and infected FEMA employees to try and save humanity? Death might not be the evil entity it appears to be. Maybe the cultists sacrifice themselves to the sun because, if you're consumed by death instead of being torn apart by a visitor, you're granted a peaceful afterlife, and not one where you're resurrected as a monster. This is further reinforced by the minor ending, where the protagonist surrenders himself to death and is granted exactly what he considers an ideal life: loneliness and isolation. This theory would be somewhat plausible if it weren't for the fact that anybody who comes into contact with death comes out horrified, if they don't unalive themselves before telling the tale. Even the cultists have petrified expressions of pure terror on their faces after burning alive and being consumed by the entity. This leads us to think that perhaps death is divided into two entities, one that offers salvation to those who embrace it, and one that feeds on the charred remains of the non-believers. A user in my previous video's comment section described the latter as fear, which I believe is an extremely fitting name for this second entity. But if this is so, why were the cultists devoured by fear and not saved by death? If anything, they were the most devoted followers out there. A personal theory of mine is that those saved by death move on to a peaceful afterlife, but those devoured by fear become its servants, the super visitors. This theory explains the origin of the Pale Man, who, according to the Ranger, was once a normal human who looked like he had seen death itself. Perhaps the same fate awaits the blind man. One thing we know for sure is that a higher power controls the visitors. It is confirmed both by the Pale Man and by the ballerina. So what is it? Are visitors controlled by a brain parasite or by a divine force? I believe it's both. It's obvious to see that not all visitors have the same capabilities. Some, like the cashier, or maybe even the protagonist, aren't even aware they're visitors, while others appear to be extremely powerful beings capable of taking out a whole squad of soldiers with their bare hands. This theory defends that in this catastrophe, humanity faces two different threats. The first is the parasite, be it from bugs, dogs, or fungi, that takes control of the brain and turns the host into an aggressive monster. And the second threat is something way beyond that. Beings that come from unknown depths, servants of death, commonly known as super visitors. They possess powers beyond those of a simple infected person. Gaping holes that instantly vaporize anybody in the room, the strength to snap rifles in half, and the reflexes to dodge shotgun pellets. While the parasite may very well be FEMA's creation, the super visitors aren't. We hear on the radio that FEMA try their hardest to contain these subjects, but can't. Aside from the obvious super visitors, there's one character who I also believe falls under this category. The Prophet, despite not showing hostility towards the protagonist, has supernatural abilities that no ordinary human could have. He claims to have some sort of third eye, the ability to see further than most. He clearly isn't lying, since he can tell from outside the house that we have a basement and that something very important lies beneath it. Since the Prophet shows no aggression and seems to want to help us out, we can safely assume he is a disciple of death and not fear, like the Pale Man. The Prophet has an obvious connection with death, through which he seems to gain these supernatural abilities. The way I see it, he acts as a messenger, an intermediary between death as an entity and the main character. The Prophet gives us a series of tasks demanded by death. The first is to let this cat inside, as the powerful entity awaits its approach. The second is to refrain from testing any guests for signs for a few days. And the last is to explore the basement and eventually meet death. So, what is the connection between death and the cat? Firstly, it is thanks to the cat playing with the carpet that we discover the basement. Secondly, the cat seems to be an extension of death in the overworld, since it has the power to halt visitors from killing anybody in your home, so long as it is fed. And lastly, as an act of gratitude, the cat also protects the protagonist by giving him one of his 9 lives. It is clear that death believes it's our time to go, doing everything in its power to finally meet us. In fact, death saves us from the terrible punishment of being alive in such dark times. After all, no one envies the living. A curious fact about the Prophet is that he appears in the intro cutscene, laying face down on a beach. Was this the Prophet in human form, before getting scorched by the sun and transformed into a super visitor? After all, we do know thanks to the Ranger's story that they were all once normal people. Maybe the super visitors were summoned as a consequence of the parasite breaking free. Perhaps death sent them to the overworld to restore order. If so, wouldn't one of its disciples being sent to our house imply that we are a visitor? A plausible theory is that the protagonist is a visitor to begin with. On TV, visitors are described as extremely paranoid and hostile with lethal force, a description that perfectly fits the average player's gameplay. Being a visitor would explain the white teeth and the fungal infection, but how did the protagonist die? I covered in my last video that he murdered his abusive parents and buried them under the house, but perhaps after getting rid of his family, the protagonist ended his own life as well, and later crawled out the basement as a visitor. Have you ever noticed that when visitors spend the night, they never kill you? Visitors don't target their own kind. Perhaps we were in fact infected from the start. Many players claim that the title of the game itself provides the answer to this question. Though this theory is far from definitive, this is my interpretation of the "no, I'm not a human" catastrophe, after almost 60 hours invested into the game and 100% of its achievements unlocked. The parasite is a fungus, part of a mind control experiment conducted by the government, similar to MKUltra. It was most likely going to be used as a biological weapon in the case of war, and not as a means to control the general population. Therefore, the parasite escaping was most definitely an accident. The unintentional outbreak of the parasite summoned FEMA, who made it their #1 priority to eradicate the pest as soon as possible, even at the cost of thousands of civilian lives. The symptoms announced by FEMA are not a blatant lie, but only partly truthful. Under no circumstance could the government completely uncover the way that this brain-consuming parasite works, in fear that other nations or independent researchers conducted experiments of their own. The sun is not in fact burning up, and the sudden rise of temperature is artificial and FEMA's method of creating an inhospitable environment for the parasite by releasing flammable substances into the atmosphere. The parasite affects all sorts of living creatures, humans, dogs, and even insects, who infect other organisms by crawling inside them. The cat is unaffected because it is not just a cat, it is the incarnation of death itself on Earth, an entity that seems to have two sides, one that is cruel and horrifying, and one that is forgiving. In this apocalypse, humanity isn't just dealing with a brain-controlling parasite, but also with beings from a higher power, some who feed off of fear and are the face of evil, and others who attempt to speak to the mortals and invite them to their realm. The way the apocalypse unfolds depends ultimately on the player. Either you're torn apart by these fungus-infested beings in your own basement, or you hide underground until FEMA manages to eradicate the plague and the temperatures are restored to normal again. Perhaps you're convinced by Death's messenger and decide to abandon this world and live the rest of your days in her realm. Or maybe you flee the city alongside a stranger, not knowing you were both infected. You spread the fungus worldwide and sentence humanity to its extinction. Or maybe your story doesn't have that much of an epic ending, and you're killed by a super visitor, left out to die by the same guests you invited into your home, crucified by a cult, or sentenced to work yourself to death for a company that hires people on the spot, given that their employees don't have a very long life expectancy. Given that this is all just one person's interpretation, I would like for this video's comment section to be a place where you feel safe to either share your own theories or refute my own. I'd also like to thank you all for the overwhelming support on my last video, and if there's anything specific you'd like to see me cover about this game, please do let me know. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.